So we've got in this chart, or in this blog, various translations of Isaiah 9:6. The NKJV has Trinitarian sounding or divinity sounding titles for 6 and 7. The Douay-Rheims has also Trinitarian sounding or divine sounding language. The NIV has also familiar Trinitarian sounding language. I'm just slowing down in the names portion. If you let your eye grab onto or look at the mighty God, everlasting Father, those two names, the two names in the middle, those are the two names that many non-Trinitarian or non-incarnation Christians or people who hold to a human Messiah, they don't like those two titles, Mighty God or Everlasting Father. So we're looking kind of at those two. The JPS, for instance, the Mighty God is planning grace, the Eternal Father, a peaceable ruler. Kind of a commentary that takes the titles away from the Son and simply puts them back in the lap of the Father. The Mighty God is planning grace. The Eternal Father, who is God, is planning a peaceable ruler. So that's what we're kind of dealing with. Let's first look at a Jewish interpretation of these verses, and from there we will move down into a Trinitarian understanding or an incarnational perspective, a divine Messiah perspective. So Trinitarian interpretation of the verses first, right? Which is the proper way to start. I'm not saying this is wrong. I'm not saying that the Jews had it completely wrong. Remember, it's helpful for us as we're having these studies to be reminded that Trinitarian theologies, Trinitarian theories, and models of God embrace not merely a human Jesus, but we also embrace a divine Jesus. So we don't have a problem with passages in the Bible that are a description of humanity of the Messiah, that describe limitations, not being all knowledgeable or not being able to be in more places at once, having a birth, praying to a divine Father in heaven or something like that. We don't have a problem with those verses because many of us who hold to a form of Trinity, i.e. we believe in the incarnation, that God that God became very flesh. We believe that Jesus is fully human and truly human. Whereas by comparison, obviously Rabbinic Judaism rejects that, and so does Biblical Unitarian. So the Jewish interpreters, as this blog reminds us, sees the meaning here much different from Christians. Some interpreters see these verses filled in Hezekiah, the royal son, who sat on the throne of David, where his father Ahaz sat. Oops, went too fast. Other Jewish interpreters clearly see this as messianic in nature, the names referring to the Messiah according to the Talmud and the Midrash. Abraham Ibn Ezra agrees the names refer to the Messiah. Michael Brown's work that we looked at last week, Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus, Volume 3, quotes Ibn Ezra's views on this verse. He has the following footnote regarding the names of Messiah, quoting from Talmudic and Midrashic sources. So now we have a quote from Dr. Brown, who is quoting Ibn Ezra. Quote, Rabbi Yosei the Galilean said, the name of the Messiah is peace, for it is said, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, end quote. That's from the Midrash Perek Shalom, page 101. Quote, the Messiah is called by 8 names. Yinom, see Psalm 72:17, Tzemach, in other words, Jeremiah 23:5, Peleh, which is wonderful, according to Isaiah 9:6, and Yoetz, which is counselor, Isaiah 9:6. Also, Mashiach, Messiah, El, God, Isaiah 9:6, and Gibor, hero, which is also Isaiah 9:6, and Aviad, Shalom, eternal Father of peace, Isaiah 9:6. And then also see Deuteronomy Rabbah 1:20. So we have a lot of titles given to the Messiah, right? 8 names according to this rabbinic list. Those were all lifted, I believe, from Dr. Brown's work there. Let's keep reading. Also, when we're dealing with rabbinic sources, we cannot forget about the Targums. So the Targums are ancient Aramaic translations or paraphrases from the original Hebrew, and they were utilized in the few centuries prior to the first century. So post-exilic period, Ezra times, things like that. But prior and going up into the first century, we had Jewish people coming out of exile who'd been in exile long enough to generations to be born that either didn't know Hebrew well enough to speak it, and so they spoke Aramaic, but Hebrew was retained as a study language when it came to reading through the Bible. So we had individuals in the synagogue who were known as Meturgamen, and they would take the Bible as was read in Hebrew in the synagogues. This is first century and earlier. They would take the Hebrew Bible that was read into Hebrew out loud, and then they would translate or paraphrase into Aramaic for the listeners who were primarily confused by the Hebrew. So they would paraphrase it and translate it. So they were simultaneous translators or paraphrastic versions of the Hebrew Bible going on in the first century and the few centuries earlier. But what ended up happening is that these paraphrases ended up getting written down. And so now we have several versions of them. Not a ton, but a handful. And Targum Jonathan, Neophiti is another one. Ankylos is another one of them. So those are three at least that I can name off the top of my head. Targum Jonathan, Neophiti, and Ankylos. Those are Targums that show up in Aramaic. So, the Targum Jonathan also references these verses in Isaiah as referring to the Messiah. Let's read the Targum Jonathan. For to us a son is born, to us a son is given, and he shall receive the law upon him to keep it. And his name is called from of old, Wonderful Counselor, Eloah, the Mighty, abiding to eternity. The Messiah, because peace shall be multiplied on us in his days. So notice, what do the Targums do? They are paraphrases, so don't be kind of alarmed by the fact that there are extra words that weren't in the Bible, in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible itself. They're not meant to be. It's meant to be a bit of a running commentary on the passages because of the lack of familiarity with the Hebrew Bible as a whole when it came time to studying the Bible in the ancient synagogues of those days. Likewise, from a rabbinic perspective, the Midrash on Deuteronomy also references these verses as referring to the Messiah. We've got about 5 minutes left. Let's keep going with looking at the rabbinic perspective of Isaiah 9:6. Rabbi Samuel, the son of Nachman, said, quote, when Esau met Jacob, he said to him, my brother Jacob, let us walk together in this world. Jacob replied, let my Lord, I pray thee, pass over before his servant. Genesis 33:14. What is the meaning of, quote, I pray thee, pass over? Jacob said to him, I have yet to supply the Messiah of whom it is said, unto us a child is born, end quote. That's the Midrash on Deuteronomy 2:4. Keep in mind also that the Midrashim of ancient rabbinic lore are also essentially either paraphrases or they have a lot of allegory in them. They have a lot of what we might call just anecdotal advice in them. Hey, this rabbi did it this way, so because he did it, and this is the way he believed, let's quote him and follow in that tradition. You know, Rabbi so-and-so said in the name of Rabbi so-and-so. So we have all these traditions that are built on top of traditions, but a lot of it is still rooted in certain biblical texts as were expounded upon by ancient Jewish authorities. Some of their exposition is not too far from truth because they try to stick close to Scripture because they have a high regard for Scripture. But at the same time, a lot of times they're blinded by their own tradition, and we're talking about rabbinic views that came along after the penning of the New Testament. Much of rabbinic Judaism is a collection of works, like Talmudic works, were in circulation orally before maybe the time of Yeshua, but were certainly codified and pinned and put down in writing after the New Testament was already put together. So a lot of it turns into polemic, as in defensive reasoning against the New Testament understanding of the Bible, things like that. So just keep that in mind as you're reading through passages and you're looking through rabbinic sources. If you're a Christian and you're trying to find support from rabbinic sources that show that, oh, look, there's a divine Messiah showing up in the rabbinic Bible, that doesn't necessarily equal an endorsement of Jesus as God veiled in flesh. Far from it, right? Remember, rabbinic Judaism, for all of its diverse opinions on whether the Messiah is human or divine, one thing they are quite unified on is their rejection of Jesus as the candidate. Yep, they're pretty solidly unified in that regard, unless we're talking about secret believers. So let's look at some of these objections to the rabbinic perspective. These verses, let's try this one more time. Objection 1, these verses do not refer to the Messiah, but to Hezekiah. So these are objections from a rabbinic perspective. This is similar to what Dr. Brown does in his books, although this isn't Dr. Brown's work that we're reading here. So, reply to objection 1. This is probably where we'll stop tonight. Clearly, based on the above quotes, the idea of this being messianic in nature is also a Jewish understanding of Scripture. Those who deny Isaiah 9:6-7 as being understood as messianic in Judaism are not being truthful in their comments, though some see Hezekiah fulfilling these verses, such as Rabbi Hillel. Other Jewish interpreters, such as Bar Kapara, write Hezekiah fell far short. See Bavli Sanhedrin 94a. That's the Talmud, by the word Bavli, the B, Sanhedrin, Talmud. The Talmud has two flavors, Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi. The Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud is what I'm referring to. All right, let's continue in this objection. The reason we know this verse is clearly messianic is because it refers to the everlasting throne of King David, right? This is another detail that I've been maintaining all along, is that when we're looking at who is this figure in the messianic passages, we have to look at the scope of his reign. And clearly, there are near and far term aspects. I'll flash this in post-production. Near term refers to a figure that might show up on the scene nearer to Israel's historical expectation of a king that's going to arrive and they can see him, and the words are applicable to their day and age. And therefore, the prophecy was partially fulfilled in the lifetime of the readers of the prophecy. So that's what we call near-term fulfillment. By the same token, many passages in the Tanakh have what's called a far term, an aspect of the prophecy that was pointing to a future that was farther away from both the prophet and the people he was writing to. And thus, the events spoken of in the far term mirror those events of the near term and create a sort of mirror effect, or two peaks, like you're seeing in the graphic in front of you right now. That's not in class, but in post-production is, where the prophet sees a mountain peak closer to him, smaller, and a mountain peak farther away from him, larger. But an optical illusion is created by the perspective of the prophet, and the valley in between the two peaks is unseen. That represents the time frame that separates the two prophecy and the events that they detail. But the language is reusable so that we end up with one prophecy, but dual application. That's what I mean by near-far prophecy. So how does that impact our study tonight? We often have a Messiah figure, a king, that's described in the Tanakh as the leader or the ruler or the person, the champion, the hero, who's going to show up in Israel's near-term history or their future. And the people could actually look forward to him right around the corner, someone that would show up on the scene that they could interact with. At the same time, the language of the prophecy indicates that there's a far-term fulfillment that can only be filled out or filled up by someone the likes of Messiah Jesus. Even Messiah Jesus only partially fulfilled some of the prophecies that were speaking about him, which in themselves were also partial prophecies about, say, King David or other Davidic kings or something to that effect, other great heroes. So there's a lot of layering going on and some nuancing going on to many of these prophecies that we have to be aware of. So this blog continues, and we'll close with this tonight. The reason we know this verse is clearly messianic is because it refers to the everlasting throne of King David, and that's the aspect of these prophecies that I keep reminding us that biblical Unitarian seems to, on the surface, not pay close enough attention to. I know they embrace the passage as Jesus, so they surely must be aware that Jesus is going to fill out these prophecies in the future. But oftentimes, they don't seem to grab hold of the fact that in order for a Messiah to be able to do some of the things that is spoken of in the scriptures, he needs to be a divine Messiah rather than just a mere human. Even if he's an exalted king who sits at the right hand of God, an exalted human, he nevertheless, the Bible still ascribes attributes and prerogatives to this Son of Man figure in the Bible that at face value don't seem to allow for a mere human to be able to do some of the things that he does. So this blog continues, it says, this characteristic is unmistakable in Scripture. To deny these verses as messianic would be to deny Scripture itself. So let's examine the nature of this child's authority. And there are some details about this child, and I want to stop right here with our study. We'll pick this up next week. We're looking at another blog post. I think I'll turn back here and go to the top so you can see the name of the blog post. We're dealing with objections to Isaiah 7:14 and Isaiah 9:6, and 6 and 7, but we're only looking at the Isaiah 9, 6, and 7 part. This is a blog post put together by truthnet.org. Let me change the view so you can see what they look like. This is what it looks like if you were to just access it on the internet. And so we're examining this passage in question from the Trinitarian leaning interpretation versus the non-Trinitarian, which is biblical Unitarian perspective. But that'll do it for a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism.